afternoon. Welcome back to Science Sundays for the first talk of the 2024-2025 academic year. Science Sundays is one of the premier outreach events of the College of Arts and Sciences. And in the College of Arts and Sciences, we pursue scholarly inquiry in a wide variety of ways, ranging from the natural and mathematical sciences to the social behavioral sciences to arts and humanities. We believe it's important to do all of these things together. And in that scholarship, we're trying to push the boundaries of knowledge in all these fields, but that's not all we're trying to do. We're also trying to share what we learn, because knowledge unshared is like knowledge undiscovered. And so we share that in our classroom teaching, we share that in our mentoring of students and postdocs, doing undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral research, and we share it here with the public. And I'd like to introduce the person who's going to introduce the speaker. So I'd like to introduce my colleague, Professor Dana Haney from the Department of Sociology. She's on the Science Sundays committee with me and 6 other people, and she'll introduce the speaker. So,
good afternoon. It is my great honor to introduce a distinguished scholar whose work has profoundly shaped the fields of sociology, criminology, political science, and terrorism studies. Dr. Laura Dugan is the Ralph D. Mershon Professor of Human Security and Professor of Sociology at OSU. Over the course of her impressive career, Dr. Dugan has been at the forefront of research aimed at understanding and addressing violence in its many forms, while assessing policies and practices that can either mitigate or exacerbate its effects. Her research spans a broad range of topics, from the violent victimization of women by intimate partners to terrorism and extremist violence. Most recently, her work has expanded to explore the divisive rhetoric used by the US and global leaders that initiate violence, a reflection of how her research continually evolves to address current national and global concerns. Dr. Dugan's innovative, multidisciplinary approach incorporates data collection, theoretical framework from various disciplines, and novel analytic methods to uncover the dynamics of violence and inform more effective interventions. As one of the founding principal investigators of the Global Terrorism Database, Dr. Dugan has been instrumental in creating one of the world's most comprehensive resources on terrorism incidents, which tracks all known incidents since the 1970s, furthering our understanding of how government responses influences terrorism and extremism. Dr. Dugan's scholarship has challenged traditional theories, contributing groundbreaking insights into how raising the benefits of abstention into violence might reduce terrorism, and how lenient responses to extremist behavior can actually perpetuate violence. Her research has been published widely in leading journals, and she is the co-author of the influential book, Putting Terrorism into Context: Lessons Learned from the World's Most Comprehensive Terrorism Database. Dr. Dugan's contributions have not only shaped academic thought, but also provided invaluable resources to policymakers, to practitioners, and researchers around the world. We are thrilled to have her here with us today, so please join me in welcoming Dr. Laura Dugan.
My mic is on. Thank you. I'm blushing. That was really sweet. Thank you, Dana. And thank you all for coming today. I'm very excited to talk to you about this topic of responding to terrorism and how misusing deterrence can fuel extremism. This is kind of a broad overview of my thoughts based on the research that I've been involved in, as well as research that others have been involved in. And I'm really happy that all of you are here to listen to what I have to say. I'm going to start off by just giving you a snapshot of what global terrorism looks like. This is from the Global Terrorism Database that Dr. Haney had mentioned that I was involved in collecting. This is actually the dates from 1970 to 2015, and you can see hotspots here. One of the things I want to point out in this slide is the definition of terrorism that I've basically adopted. It's very broad, and choosing a definition of terrorism can be quite controversial, which is why I choose broad, because it's more like kitchen sink. But for specific research projects, we may carve it to be more specific. But let me just read it so you have a sense of what I'm referring to as I talk throughout my time here, which I just remembered I should set my timer so that I don't talk too long. So I use the threatened and actual use of illegal force and violence by non-state actor to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, and intimidation. I also want to show that Australia has had relatively little terrorism during this period. I know I blocked it for that definition. More recently, I want to show you what 2023 looks like. It says 2024, but that's just when it's published because we're still in 2024. This is a different source. This is the Global Terrorism Index, where bright red colors means more severe terrorism risk and terrorism, like effects of terrorism, whereas the lighter colors is less. And I want to point out at the bottom that the top 5 countries are Burkina Faso, Israel, Mali, Pakistan, and Syria. And those are the ratings that they have. The ratings, as you can see, go from 0 to 10. My understanding is that this is the first time that Afghanistan and Iraq weren't at the top of the list. I want to point out what the list looks like. And in particular, because of where we live, I wanted to point out where the United States is on that list. So we are somewhere in the middle. We are middle risk, not low risk. And I think that's worth noting. Just so you can have a context of what this means, it's more than just reds and light and yellows. These are lives that are put at risk because of violence. And so I'm just going to show you the 3 most deadly attacks since 2020. Unsurprising, the October 7th attack in 2023 on Israel is the most violent attack that has happened in the past so many years, where you can see that 1,200 people were killed and such. Then, since then, or also during this period in Ethiopia, the drop is by almost 1,000, where 222 were killed, and these were by militants in a region over in there. This is an image of military who came in after the attack, and then we have the fatalities that occurred in. Oh my God, goodness! I do need my glasses. So in Niger, where we had 200 fatalities, and these were attacks they suspect by the Islamic State of Greater Sahara, as well as Jamaat Nusrat al-Islam. And anyway, so there were 200 military that were attacked. Now I want to come back to the United States. I wanted you to have a sense of what things look like in the world, but let's look at our own country, because I think it's important that we pay attention to that as well. And so this graph shows basically, again, through the Global Terrorism Database, the number of attacks and the number of fatalities from 1970 to 2020. I'm bringing it up to 2020 because, unfortunately, the Global Terrorism Database stopped collecting in the middle of 2021, and that's the last full year. And but it's striking to see how the patterns had changed over time. You're probably not surprised that the highest number of fatalities happened on September 11th. Since all of you have been around for probably as long as I have, you probably know the next most lethal time event in the United States, and that was in Oklahoma City in 1995. So let's look at ideologies behind these attacks. So what you can see here, this is the same graph of number of attacks that I showed you before. Red is far right, blue is far left, and black is jihadi, and then we have other and unknown. I want to point out that these are very broad ideologies. There's a lot of mixtures that happen within those, but there's some themes throughout that hold them together. And so what I want to point out is that in the earlier part of the collection of these database, we see far left was very active, but not very active once we move past the closer to, past into the new millennium. Whereas far right has been active throughout, and we see very little activity with jihadi here in the United States. As we look at fatalities, this shouldn't be surprising again, because we see that the September 11th attacks, again, were jihadi, which is any sort of Islamic extremism, but it's religious Islamic extremism. And then we have the far right involved with Oklahoma City. We see that the number of fatalities during September 11th makes it hard to see any sort of variation of fatalities, and so else during any other time periods. And so I wanted to just focus in on 2002 on forward, so you can get a sense of what terrorist attacks have looked like in the United States since September 11th. And I find that these two graphs, the one on the left are number of attacks by ideology, and the one on the right is number of fatalities. And I should point out that these are stacked graphs, area charts. So when you see lots of mass, that means lots of attacks or lots of fatalities, and the thinner ones mean fewer. And so you can see that a lot of this has been driven by far right, more than any other ideology since 2002. I put the administrations, embedded the administrations over this period so that you can see the activity during I like to think of it as sort of a political framework of a tactical period, because governments respond differently depending on what administration is in charge. And so you can kind of see how these lay upon each other. And then, of course, because we've lived through most of them, we can imagine what was going on during these time periods, which we can talk about. Now, what I would like to do is give you a little bit of a flavor of what some of these attacks look like. And so I just picked one from different ideologies where there was one fatality so that we can look at them. I'm not going to, so I lifted the summaries from the Global Terrorism database so that we can see what was written about them. I'm not going to read the summaries, but I did bold the main points. This is far left, and you may remember back in 2017 when an assailant opened fire on the Congressional Republican baseball practice game in Alexandria, Virginia. This I bolded at the bottom. The assailant had previously criticized the policies of the Republican Party and Donald Trump. And so this is why it was listed as a terrorist attack, and it seems pretty clear. Now, again, I'm talking kitchen sink. I'm not interested in getting into whether it's terrorism or not, but using the definition that we use, that there's this ideology behind it that is linked to what had happened, that's where we are. Now, when we look at far right, here is an example where assailants opened fire on federal security officers outside of a federal building in Oakland, California, and why they're linked to it's considered far right is because the attacker stated that he was aligned with the Boogaloo movement and wanted to carry out attacks against the federal law enforcement personnel. So a lot of people tend to leave manifestos, so we have a sense of what their ideologies are. And then with jihadi, we have another assailant opened fire on a soldier and attempted to ram his vehicle into the gate at a naval air station in Texas. And here sources say that he has expressed support for hardline Islamic clerics in Al-Qaeda and the Arabian Peninsula. And then this is one that was coded as other. I actually did not code the ideologies. This one, could be a little fuzzy and could be more of a far left than another, but as you can see, this person was considered a martyr to some people. Here's where an assailant who was armed with an incendiary device and firearm attacked a Northwest Detention Center. And at the bottom, you can say that he claimed that detention camps are abominations, right? And so anyway, and then you can see that he was martyrized. In fact, finding images of him was not hard to do because there was a lot of publicity around him. Anyway, so that's what the terrorism side of this looks like. I come from public policy, as Dr. Haney was saying. I've been in criminology and sociology, but my doctorate's actually in public policy. So I've always been interested in what policy what can we do to help mitigate violence? That's really what I care the most about. And so when looking at terrorist violence, I am interested in how do governments respond, and how do public officials respond. And there's been a lot of different ways to respond, but they tend to fall into two categories. The first is military, and then the second is through law enforcement. And so there's also politicians, and there's also through other parts of the criminal justice system. But these are the two main ways of responding. And if we look at military, the military, as it says here, is traditionally, it's traditionally involved with state-on-state violence, traditionally. But terrorist violence is more complicated than that. And I have this slide that I just want to make you think about. And it's how does terrorism compare to state-on-state conflict? And then I have a qualifier here, because with every statement I'm about to say, I can give an exception to it. So I added generally. Generally, this is true, but it's not always true. And we can think of lots of different examples. The first is that with terrorism, oftentimes diplomatic institutions just don't exist. There's not a natural way to do negotiations, although, again, we can think of exceptions. Whereas with state-on-state, there are institutions that are in place just for that. Geographic boundaries are amorphous with terrorism. Oftentimes, they blend and they go over with a lot of different places, and so it's hard to really look at to define regions. And that's actually one of the powers for terrorist organizations, is that they can be amorphous. Capabilities are asymmetrical. And so this is kind of like Camp Obvious. States obviously have more resources and more power. However, they also have more visibility and accountability, whereas smaller organizations don't have the visibility and the accountability, which gives them a lot more flexibility in how to perpetrate attacks. And then also, where they are similar is that state-on-state conflict, as well as terrorist conflict, is a conflict of ideas and values, oftentimes. Not always in terms of state-on-state, but there's often these conflicting ideas and values. And then also attacks, which is similar for both, is that attacks are designed to speak to multiple, overlapping sometimes audiences. These are messages. These are often campaigns of propaganda. These are about winning the hearts and minds and drawing attention to movements, whether it's state-on-state or whether it's state and non-state activity. And so what's important here is that mistakes that are made when responding to attacks can reverberate for generations, and we've seen that. We've seen that all over the world. And so this is something that needs to be taken very seriously. Now, turning to the other piece, law enforcement is traditionally how we address crime, and so that raises the question, and it's a question I've asked a lot in my career, particularly being involved in criminology, is can we rely on criminological theory to address terrorism? We tend to do so. Is it a valid thing to do? And I wrote a paper a long time ago that just compares the two when we were trying to convince criminologists to pay attention to this issue. There's a lot of similarities with regular crime and terrorism. Here they are listed. They both cross disciplinary boundaries. So from a research perspective, a lot of different scholars can look at it from their different frameworks, which is important. Both crime and terrorism is socially constructed. I had to give a definition. It's the definition I use. It is not the definition that everybody adopts. Depending on what you're focusing on is how you shape the definition. For me, what's important is that you state the definition. Same as with crime. Breaking the law depends on what laws are out there, and laws vary over time and place. And so both are amorphous. So that leads to definitional ambiguity. And then where, again, demographics tends to be the same people who are involved in both. Loosely, young men. Young men are involved in both crime and terrorism. Not always, but generally that's the case. There's obviously some variability there. And then finally, both undermine social trust. When living in a place that is crime-ridden or living in a place that has a lot of risk of terrorism, there's a lot of anxiety, and it leads to some problems. Where they different, and these differences are very important, and it's important that we pay attention to them, is that, well, first of all, terrorism is not a specific offense. We as the collectors of the Global Terrorism Database, we'd find there'd be a body, and is this a murder or is it a terrorist attack? They can look the same, but the difference is that the motive behind them. And so terrorism is not an offense, it is a motive, right? And also, terrorism crosses jurisdictional boundaries. Now, obviously, crime can do that, but there's usually an area where attacks happen and persons flee to. And oftentimes, the perpetrators in attacks travel to particular destinations for their activities or for their attacks. Next one is super important. Terrorists, they seek recognition. They want publicity. I mentioned earlier that this is about publicity. Crime is not. Crime is not. Crime is about getting away with something without drawing attention. Related to that, terrorists operate toward a broader goal that is not about, maximizing their personal benefits. It's usually often perceived as they're acting on behalf of a larger group, and oftentimes, from their perspective, it's altruistic. There's a phrase I'm sure all of you have heard. I think it was first stated by Arafat, but I can be wrong, is that one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. And so in studying this, I use the term terrorism very loosely because it's a place where people can go, but people don't identify as terrorists, and that's important to know. They're identifying on a mission to help people, and they will use these tactics in order to do so. And then finally, the last one is that terrorism innovates. Why I think it's important that definitions be revisited and stated explicitly is because as soon as we make a definition, there'll be something that does not fit in the box. These are living, breathing organisms that can look and taste a lot of different ways, and they're aligned with technology. I heard of Twitter because of a terrorist attack more than I knew about what was happening on social media. Attack in Mumbai where the groups were coordinating by posting on Twitter their different tactical things and responding to it through anonymous accounts. And I'm like, what's Twitter? This was back in 2008. And so oftentimes they're on top of technology. Why all this is important is because states do have the tools of diplomacy, military, criminal justice systems at their disposal, and most of them use a mixture of options that are available to them. But having said that, some are more attractive than others, and that's what's important to understand here. And I made this drawing. It's not scientific at all. It's based on some clip art I made a long time ago. But I think it's fairly accurate to give you a picture, at least within the United States, what responses to terrorism look like before and after September 11th. If you look at the before, you can see that mostly the criminal justice system was involved. There's a little bit of military, but for the most part, so the badges are law enforcement, and the weight things are judicial system. There's a little bit of politics involved here, which is the blue with the feather pen, and then but we did have some military, and mostly the military responses dealt with overseas conflicts, and that was more involved during the Clinton administration, closer as we were getting toward the turn of the century. After September 11th, what you see is that there's a lot more dense activity going on, and there's a lot more military involvement, and this is aligned with the global the war on terror, the global war on terror in response to September 11th. I wanted to map this on top of the graph that I showed you earlier, just to get so that you can get a sense of things that happened. And my sense is that most of the people in the room remember this transition. Prior to September 11th, there was not a lot of public discussion about terrorism, and some of the things that the U.S. was involved in weren't highly publicized, although we knew about some of these major attacks on U.S. targets in Africa as well as in Yemen, so with the SS Cole. I want to focus in on the second part of this image and a graph I showed you earlier, and just so that we can put this in perspective, what was going on in the U.S. in terms of U.S.'s response to terrorism and what terrorism, domestic terrorism, or I should say terrorism in the U.S. country, here within the states, look like. This is a graph I showed you before, and what we see is that it was rather low during the initial phases in the global war on terror. Everything dropped. And then there was a rise, but note that this rise didn't kick up until, oh, there we go, I have a mouse, until during this period. I don't have the presidential administrations mapped up on this, but this is around the midterms of Barack Obama running for president. This was also during the period where there was a lot of screaming and activity around the birther movement. The Tea Party was becoming a lot more active. I'm not saying that the Tea Party is a terrorist movement at all, but there was a lot happening in this country in reaction to having a black president. And so here's where I'm departing in talking about crime theory, because I want to sort of try to explain, or I'm going to share with you what I think was going on here based on a lot of empirical research, as well as criminological and sociological theory. But I want to first take us back to the US criminal justice system and how it was designed during the period of Enlightenment, and it was based on the writings of Cesare Beccaria, who was an Italian philosopher during the Age of Enlightenment. This is what he looked like, and this is his most influential book, or the most relevant influential book for the United States on crime and punishment. And this book was read by our founding fathers and had a large role in designing our criminal justice system. Now, I bolded a part of this that I think it's important that you understand. Remember, the context of the founding of this country was separating itself from England, where the punishment, and this was actually a movement all over Europe, as well as here in the United States, because punishment for crimes was incredibly harsh compared to the crimes that were perpetrated. And so one of the things that he says is that if an equal punishment be ordained for two crimes that injure society in different degrees, but they have the same punishment, then there is nothing to deter men from committing the greater of these two, right? So think about, I always think about 3 strikes you're out. If you remember, that was a big thing that was happening in the early 90s, right? If you commit three crimes, you get caught doing 3 crimes, you're just going to go to jail for life. And so on that 3rd crime, if somebody is about to get caught, they might as well shoot the witness, because they're going to go to jail for the rest, go to prison no matter what, right? And so that's what it's saying, is that if I'm going to be punished the same way, whether I do this little thing or this big thing, I might as well do this big thing. And that's from the perspective of the state, but we'll come back to Beccaria and think about it from the perspective of people in a minute. What this raises, though, is this idea of proportionality. Let the punishment be proportional to the crime. So I'm also going to talk about deterrence a little bit deeper, coming from the perspective of criminologists who've been studying this. There are 3 components that are really important that go into this sort of rational framework of deterrence. The first is certainty of punishment. How likely am I to get caught? Well, research has pretty consistently shown that this is really important. If there's a high probability of getting caught, then people are going to make different choices. What we base a lot of policy on, though, is severity of punishment. We need to make sure that people suffer if they do these crimes. But research has shown very little evidence that this is actually effective. One thing in particular is that there's no evidence that the death penalty helps deter any crimes, any severe crimes. Thirdly is celerity of punishment. How quickly is somebody punished? We do have research evidence for this, which is another reason why the death penalty isn't a great deterrent, because it's not swift, right? People sit on death row for a really long time. Some die before they ever reach the death penalty. And so really, this idea of proportionality, which is severity of punishment, at least from this perspective, is really suggests that it is not an important component that would actually deter anything from happening. Now I ask, how does this play out with terrorist violence? Well, certainly U.S. presidents have publicly adopted deterrence-based approaches to terrorism, and I'm going to just present 3 sets of quotes. First from Ronald Reagan, let terrorists beware that when rules of international behavior are violated, our policy will be one of swift and effective retribution. Note that swift is celerity, so yes, and effective retribution, that's speaking from a place of both celerity as well as certainty, right? And so this is language of deterrence. After September 11th, these are 3 famous quotes by George Bush. We're going to get bin Laden dead or alive, it doesn't matter to me. Speaks to certainty and severity in terms of whether or not that he'll live. We're going to smoke him out, speaks to certainty. Bring him on, we got the force necessary to deal with the security system. This is projecting strength, which is, again, this is something that's important, and I'll come back to this a little bit later. It's important during a time of fear and uncertainty to project this type of strength. It's probably a little unfair to put a quote by Donald Trump in here, but I will. Loser terrorists must be dealt with in a much tougher manner. This is focusing on severity. Their internet is their main recruiting tool, which we must cut off and use better. Anyway. There's endless amounts of examples of political rhetoric that relies on deterrence. And again, there's a number of reasons why this is so. And by the way, I'm not saying deterrence is a bad thing at all. I'm saying that we need to understand it and use it smartly. Let's look at empirical findings of deterrence. I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs, and I'll be clear on how to interpret them. These are research that I've been involved in, as well as research that some of my colleagues have been involved in. This is a study I did a long time ago with colleagues Gary Lafree and Alex Picaro, and we were interested in looking. There was this wave of airline hijackings in the late 60s and early 70s, and we were really interested in looking to see what caused the decrease in these hijackings. And there were 4 periods that different policies and laws came into place to reduce these, or in activities. And so you can see Cuba makes hijacking a crime. A number of these hijackings were people trying to get back into Cuba. Tighter screening, we had profiling in August of 72. And then big ones were in early 1973, US metal detectors, law enforcement, and then an agreement with the US and Cuba. I'm going to show you a graph on the next slide. And what I want you to know about this graph and any of the graphs that I'm going to be showing you in the future is that when things go down, that means a reduction. And when things go up, that means an increase. And so we analyze these data looking at specific kinds of hijackings. And what you see here is on the left, there's the total number of hijackings, then hijackings in the US, then non-US hijackings, Cuban hijackings, terrorism hijackings, and non-terrorism hijackings. And we looked at Cuba policies, tighter screenings, and those 1973 policies. You can see that they were effective for different types of hijackings. The Cuban one worked for Cuba, so that tells us that we did something right. But what I want to point out here is the absence of effects for terrorism-motivated hijackings. What we see is that these policies didn't really change much, at least in the data that we had during this period. All of these different policies were about certainty of punishment. But it didn't look, it seemed as if the terrorist-motivated ones were immune to that threat. The next one is we were looking at Northern Ireland and in the UK, and the British government had a number of different types of efforts to intervene in Republican violence, terrorist attacks. These are listed here. I'm not going to go into what they are. And you can see the number of attacks are mapped behind it. But when we did analysis on these were the results. And what stands out is that there's evidence of deterrence with Operation Motorman. This was a surge of military activity in the period, in like very in a short period of time. There were lots of military that came into the region, and there was a drop in the risk of Republican attacks. However, we see that these other things that happened, internment, criminalization, and a Gibraltar attack, could be a possible backlash. There was a possible backlash. This interaction between those who were committing the attacks and the government. I did some work with my colleague Erica Chenoweth on Israel during the first and second Intifada. This looks at the second Intifada, and this is when Israel would do repressive acts toward Palestinians. And what you can see, this is a different chart, but you can see that it's going up. And this is, again, evidence of backlash, that when Israel did repressive acts towards particularly Palestinian civilians, there was more terrorist activity, increased the risk. This is colleagues of mine looked at activity right after the assassination of Osama bin Laden, and you can see that there was this jump in attacks, again showing evidence of backlash. So is deterrence a useful counterterrorism strategy? That's a question. There are other results, and it's funny, I've talked about this in a number of ways, and I need to update some of these examples, but I think they're still relevant today, even though they're a little outdated. Here are some other results, empirical results. This is interesting. This study from 1993 I love, because what Enders and Sandler found is that there was a reduction in hijackings with metal detectors looking, so they found something a little bit different. But what they also found was that there was an increase in other forms of hostage-taking situations, which suggests a substitution, right? And so something worth paying attention to, that if we block one way and increase certainty in one way, there could be another outlet. Bombings, U.S. bombings in Afghanistan increased Osama bin Laden's popularity in the region. It may have reduced the immediate threat, but there's other things that happen that leads to a growth in the longer game of what's happening here. This is one I'm referring to that is still relevant today. This is from 1997, a long time ago, but we've seen this happen over and over again, including right now, that Israel's bombings in Lebanon reduced immediate rocket attacks, reduced the immediate threat of violence. However, it increases international support for Hezbollah during that period, and we've been seeing a rise in popular support for Hamas around the world, which is concerning. It's concerning to me as somebody who's been studying this for a long time. Carson, a former student of mine, found that declines in the risk of eco-terrorist attacks following U.S. legislation where they enacted anti-environmental terrorism laws back in the early 2000s. And then Pridemore and Freilich found no evidence of deterring or inciting anti-abortion violence following U.S. legislation. This was a huge wave of attacks, particularly in the 1990s and early 2000s of groups attacking abortion clinics, bombing them and killing doctors who perform them. So what does this mean? Well, ideologically motivated perpetrators do not seem to have the same incentives as traditional criminals, which shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but it is deems being stated explicitly, particularly because we use these interventions to try to reduce terrorism. So even though it may be obvious to some, it's worth having empirical evidence for it. And then I love this quote from the time I wrote the paper on the IRA, that an IRA member stated that the British security forces are the best recruiting officers we've had. So let's go back to Beccaria. So cautions around misuse deterrence, especially in times of crisis. Here we have, I mentioned, disproportionately severe. This is another quote by him, where a punishment to be just should have only that degree of severity which is sufficient to deter others. All that extends beyond deterrence is abuse, not justice. And then I want to compare that to one of the quotes by George Bush during this period. Our war on terror begins with al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. And I bring that up with proportionality because the attacks, as atrocious as they were on September 11th, and they were indeed atrocious, the response to it was much bigger. And it kept going long after those involved have been punished. But it's not clear. Studying these things mean we need to be able to see the grays, because in times of crisis and uncertainty, nations perceive they need leaders who project strength and use language that can help calm us down, right? And so by pulling on the language of George W. Bush during this time of crisis, it's not fair to point out that he's sort of violating the principles of deterrence theory. So we want to keep that line. We want to keep that in mind, but you can see, as I stated here, that it's a very fine line to walk if we are to be conscious of it. Now, I want to offer another piece of caution around deterrence, and that is that Beccaria warns us that it should not be disproportionately lenient. We don't think about that one a lot, but this is probably the piece I really want us to pay attention to. And I'm not going to read this whole quote because it's a big part, but I did bold a part that I want you to see, and that's that men are more strongly invited to crimes by sanctuaries than they are deterred by punishment. Right? So if we look the other way, it's going to keep happening. And I want us to think about that. And I'm going to now put up a quote by John Ashcroft which is something he shared to a group of governors a week after 9/11. So it wasn't even a week. I think it was Friday. And that's basically, I'm just going to read the bolded part, and that's that every American is basically saying that today's terrorists enjoy the benefits of our free society. So I am reading the whole thing because it's important. Even as they commit themselves to our destruction, they live in our communities, plotting, planning, and waiting to kill Americans again, right? So let's be fearful. Every American must help us defend our nation against this enemy. Every state, every country, every municipality must join together to form common defense against terrorism. This is setting the tone for what's to happen afterwards. And one of the things that happens afterwards, and this graph is showing you what happened with anti-Muslim Arab hate crimes in the United States during this period. So if you look at the bottom of the graph, we can see that prior to September 11th, there was less than 100 per year. September 11th, it shot up during 2001, which, this is, if you think about it, if it's a reaction to 9/11, which I think it was, there was only 4 months left, and it shot up that much. And so if we think about it, rates per month, it's very dramatic. Never went down, oops, let me come back. Never went down to the levels it was before. It never went down to below 100. And then we see again this rise during during the second campaign season of Barack Obama. We see another rise in these hate crimes that continued into the Trump administration. And so what we have is this sort of rise of vigilante violence, and a number of the rhetoric around these attacks were very clear that these people were being blamed for 9/11. And this was being mirrored by the activities of our government, who were detaining Muslim men or brown-skinned men, Arab men who weren't even Muslim, Sikhs, for no reason at all, except for suspicion of being, with the passage of the Patriot Act, the suspicion of them being involved in terrorism. Nobody, none of those thousands of men have ever been linked to any activity. So during this period, coming back to misuse of deterrence, we have this idea of disproportionately severe and disproportionately lenient. With disproportionately severe, there's been lots of research that points out this idea of this loss of legitimacy of the government. There's people villainize the government, and anti-government movements begin to build. This is what I say leads to backlash, where we have disproportionate leniency. What this does is when we turn the other way, it legitimizes bad behavior, it draws the focus elsewhere toward a scapegoat, and then it also leads to vigilantism. And this is where I say that it gets into emboldenment. Now, I can talk a lot about emboldenment with some other research that I've been involved in, but this is really the two things that I want us to focus on. So in the years prior to and following 9/11, what was the most serious terrorist threat? I ask that not because I expect you to yell it out, but I say this because if we think about the news and what we heard on media throughout this period, it would be very natural for us to say Islamic extremism, because that's all that our focus was. But let me just show you again what was going on. This is just looking at 1994 to 2020, and what you can see is that the most severe threat since 9/11 was the rise in far right here in the US. Okay? Now, I'm aware that we have about 5 minutes left, and so I'm going to go a little bit fast to give you a flavor, because I want to end with what we can do about this. I've done some research that does some empirical, it's unpublished research, so it's still in the writing phases, but I've done some analysis that looks at both emboldenment and backlash. And this shows some graphs that looks at far right, which is in red, and then jihadi, which is in black. And I also look at jihadi attacks against the US elsewhere and overseas, looking at hate crimes as well as looking at presidential speeches where they mention Islamic extremism. And we find, my colleague Darren Fisher and I find both evidence of backlash and emboldenment. And so here's the positive part, or here's the part where I want to raise questions. Can we incentivize cooperation? Is there a way that governments and policy could build incentives around cooperation as opposed to just reactions? Because both of these, emboldenment and backlash, is just going to lead to more violence if we apply military, if we apply criminal justice responses. And so are there ways to raise benefits of abstaining from terrorism? This is a big question that I've been asking. Looking at more from a rational perspective. And here's just some examples of things that have been found in research in the past, is that establishing Basque autonomous communities in the Spanish Constitution was related to a decrease in violence by Basque separatists in Spain, right? Giving some sort of legitimacy and some space to have their own communities. The Turkish government opening up educational and health facilities to Kurdish populations has been effective in reducing violence amongst some of the Kurdish extremisms. Undoing previous restrictions, leaving curfews have been effective, and then also releasing prisoners. I want to point out two things. The first thing I want to point out is just something that I think is important that came to my mind just now, and also may have just left my mind, so let me pause for a second. I got so excited that as I build up to this, it'll come back to me. It was a brilliant thought. Anyway, let me give you the second thought, which is a little bit brilliant, but not that thought, because I wasn't excited about it. I am excited about this, but I've been thinking about it for years. These different ideas, or these different ways of addressing. Oh, my brilliant thought! It came back to me. These are actions by governments addressing needs of people. One of the things that's a persistent, I wouldn't say finding, but it is come out in findings, but you can observe it, is that when people are in need, others like Hezbollah and Hamas and other violent extremist organizations meet those needs. And I think it's really important that we remember that. And that is tied to this, because some of these different things are directed at individuals, and some of these, oh, I have one more, de-radicalization programs. Some of these actions only affect the perpetrators, like releasing prisoners, but some of them affect the community of supporters, the constituencies. And supporters is a loose term because it's not necessarily that these people are supportive of violence. So let's think about what a constituency is. A constituency, they could be the muse for the mission, meaning that we fight for them. They can provide financing. They can be a recruiting pool, right? The British government is the best recruiting tool we have because they harm people. A research study that I was involved in a while ago found that when the constituency, Armenian constituency, withdrew support for Asala and because of a terrible attack that they did in Paris, there was a huge drop in their support, and they publicly denounced the organization. And what happened is that both Asala and another Armenian terrorist organization just dropped in their activities and went away because they did not have the support of the people they were fighting for. So this brings to my, I was asked once a long time ago to write a provocative policy proposal, and I'm hoping it's not as provocative now in 2024 as it was in 2009. But my idea is that we should target the same groups of disenfranchised persons to participate in policy process and make them active stakeholders in reducing their violence to their vulnerability to radical rhetoric. I have a graphic for this. I love graphics. Here are vulnerable people, however they're identified. There's a number of ways to identify them. Violent extremists want them. And what I suggest is that the government should pay attention to their needs and fold them in, pay attention to everyone's needs. And so in research, that same research I did with the colleague Erica Chenoweth, what we found is that when Israel, during the second intifada, the second uprising, the time of suicide bombings, but when Israel behaved conciliatory toward Palestinian civilians, there was a decrease in Palestinian violence, which suggests that there is something to this, right? And so at the very least, it suggests the government should also look at alternative strategies to reduce terrorism, traditional deterrence, especially acts that affect innocent people, could be more harmful than helpful. And again, this can reverberate for generations, and we have seen it. So what this brings me down to is conclusions. We have evidence of both emboldenment and backlash. Proportionality matters in efforts to deter. Lawbreakers need to be treated equally. So don't turn our backs on somebody or turn our heads on somebody who does something violent because they look like us. They're not just boys will be boys. We need to take it all very seriously. Bias need to be recognized and guarded against, right? We need to look at ourselves. We all have it. We all have these biases toward treating people like us better than people who are different from us. And we need to be very vigilant about being aware of it. What governments do matter. There's a lot of unintended consequences. This is what got me into studying policy, are the unintended consequences. And also what governments do can change depending on who's leading. And that was the point of putting the different administrations over the different waves of terrorism. And then also how constituencies are treated matters. And political extremists pay attention. This is something I didn't talk about, but it comes out in the research, is that political extremists pay attention to other extremists. They may not be in direct communication, but these are public activities, and they respond to what others do. And we should be aware of that. This is not happening in a vacuum. So they also pay attention to how their constituencies are treated. That's what I have. And so I kept it not quite. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So probably there are some questions for Professor Dugan. I can't see very well, so just raise your hand.
Over here, John.
Okay.
Which I was expecting you to be the first.
Would you apply your conclusions to the situation the most current one, obviously, is Gaza and Israel? And not everything fits this, but you seem to be saying pretty closely that Israel's doing everything wrong.
Oh, yes, yes. I mean,
Okay, can you repeat the question?
He asked me, I can repeat it. So he asked, how would I apply these ideas to what's happening in Gaza, in Israel? And by what I have been saying, it seems that I would say that Israel is doing everything wrong. I can tell you that on October 8th, and what happened on October 8th, I felt ill for all the same reasons everybody else felt ill, but I especially felt ill because I knew what the state of Israel would do. The current government in Israel, Netanyahu, had basically got into a coalition with the far right. And that government, the far right in Israel, has been winning a holy war for a long time. Hamas has been winning a holy war for a long time. Some of the other findings from that study I did was during the Oslo lull period, when there were active peace agreements happening that were looking very promising. There was a decrease in violence, but when I did the analysis, what I found is that during that peace period, when there was conciliation, there was an increase in violence because the extremes on both sides did not want peace. So what's happening is horrific. It's horrific, and it is. So I am anti-violence. I am anti-violence. What Hamas did was horrific, and I define terrorism because of the legacy of what was handed to me. So I only look at it from the sub-state actors. However, looking at responses by the government, bombing and killing, so many civilians in Gaza is just going to affect that region for the rest of our lives, and it's awful. Yeah, I mean, I knew that was going to happen. I think most people who study this knew that was going to happen. But what would be a different thing to have happen? I don't know, because I don't have the intelligence. But not that. There had to be a way to rescue the hostages, try to rescue the hostages without killing innocent people.
Go ahead, sir, in the back there.
Yeah, I was intrigued by your last bullet point on your concluding takeaways there. And it seems, what you said earlier, it seems intuitively obvious when you try to satisfy or address the needs and unmet grievances of the constituency groups, the terrorist actions by that group goes down. That makes sense. But you also said other terrorist groups, look at how other groups have been treated. And so wouldn't that incentivize other unrelated groups whose constituencies have unmet grievances and needs to go ahead and accelerate terrorist activities so that their constituent groups would have better met needs?
Okay. So let me tell you where that
Can you repeat it again? Just
yes,
summarize.
I'll repeat it. I don't. But let me first say that what I think you're asking me is actually a little different from what that bullet means, and that's my fault, not yours. So the question was, my last bullet point, which was that that these groups watch how we respond to different attacks and how we respond to different constituencies. They watch what's going on, not because they're in communication with each other, but because we're living in a global world where we see things, they see things. Just, if we see it, they see it. And so the question was, then, is there a way I had a hard time following you because we were just using a lot of pronouns and not identifying exactly who we're talking about. And so, but the question was around, would this just incentivize violence elsewhere? Let me tell you what that finding was about. If you recall, the graph that I showed you actually had jihadi attacks against Americans elsewhere. What we found was that when there was an increase in jihadi attacks in the US, there was a decrease in jihadi attacks elsewhere. when there was an increase in far-right violence in the US, there was also an increase in jihadi attacks elsewhere. I don't know if that's related to what you were saying, but what this is suggesting is that when the US is involved with, like when the far right is doing things, I mean, I didn't have a hypothesis around this, but what it suggests is that they pay attention to some of our domestic activities. And I don't know if that's true, but it's something we need to be aware of. But there's an inverse relationship. Jihadi attacks against Americans elsewhere, there's a reduction in the US of jihadi attacks. And there's a little bit of evidence in terms of what these people say that suggests that there is more of a substitution thing going on, but it's just worth paying attention to. I don't know if that supports or has anything to do with what you thought was going on, but that's what that's about.
There'll be more time to go into detail at the reception. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, hi. I feel that here. You do want to know if that, well, the state that Ellie, both holds up, you take it. You must go study.
Yeah, so the question was, in 2001, there were anthrax envelopes being sent to senators and other public officials throughout the U.S. I remember that. I was living in the D.C. area at the time, so we didn't want to go near our mail. And so the question was, who's behind that? And if I recall, it kind of got quiet around it, but I could be wrong about this, but my recollection is that it came across as that it was more of a rogue lab technician. I see some nodding, and that doesn't mean I'm right. Then it wasn't related to 9/11 or anything like that. It was more of a rogue lab technician that was doing these things. What? Oh my God. I want to say Florida, but I might just be making that up. I actually was reading about this more recently because of, because of a lot of dealing with any sort of bio agent is so dangerous. So I was reading a book that was talking about lab accidents and how common they are, and like so common, but how they're hidden from like everyone. They're hidden from us, but they're hidden by the lab technicians, by the scientists, as well as by the governments, because they don't want people to panic. And the issues with biohazards is that even those who are handling them can't predict what's going to happen with them. And so it made reference to these anthrax attacks and said something about somebody in a lab that went rogue with them. And so I don't know if it was related to drawing attention to that, but it was sort of muted pretty quickly. I remember Senator Daschle was one of the ones that revisited. This is something I'd have to look up. But, and they mentioned a lab in Florida in this book. Yes. Oh, Google. Yes, thank you.
So,
Thank you. Thank you. Teaching is a whole new world with Google. Almost always. I'll be like, I'll get back to you. And somebody's like, actually, Dr. Dugan. Thank you. I'm glad I was informed.
So let's do one more question, and then we'll go have a cookie. Go ahead.
just one to the question. I was able to study some of the terroristic group and left way up, let's say, by storage of that, and now we have growth in the right hand. Why there was less growth of the left way? That is the reason for that the needles to you for putting all the right.
Oh, that's an awesome question. So for those of you who couldn't hear it, we had, so at the very beginning of the database, we had there's huge left-wing terrorism going on in the U.S. And then it dropped tremendously, and we see this growth in right-wing that's happening now, far right. Why can't we use what we did in the 70s to drop left-wing to suppress right-wing here? That's awesome. There's a quote that I have it's either on my car or my fridge from Einstein that talks about the importance of understanding the problem. And far left and far right are very different. If we look at fatalities, we see almost none with far left. Far lefts were committing these acts, bombings and stuff to draw attention to wars and Vietnam, and also some stuff going on in Puerto Rico. But they didn't want to kill people because they were fighting for the people. So left, whereas the right is less about community and the people and more about othering. And so I think that, from my perspective, I think what's important is understanding and speaking to the fears and the grievances of people and finding ways other ways to mitigate them than to continue to exacerbate them. So languages around fear and things that fuel those sort of anxieties, I think, are the ways to go, which wouldn't have been very useful for addressing what was happening in the early 70s around the anti-war and Weather Underground and some of those things that were going on. And there's also like environmental terrorism is going on at those times. Again, not wanting to harm people, but wanting to actually harm companies that were profiting off of doing damages to the environment, to animals and war. So, again, I think if I could summarize what all of this has taught me is that context matters. There's not one solution. Context really matters.
Okay, so let's go upstairs to the traditions room, which is back that way and up to the second floor. There's coffee, cookies, etc. Have a snack, kibitz with Dr. Dugan, and let's thank her on the way out.